Good to see you here. Okay, let's go ahead and get started. As Shannon said, we'll be recording the call and then transcribing it and sharing later on Apropedia on our page. You can follow the agenda and take notes in this Google Doc. You should have creating access, so if you want to make any notes. And you can also have the introduction section. And there you can leave your email if we can send you an email about future calls. If you're interested in receiving more information about future calls, please leave your email and your name there. You can also, of course, use the Zoom chat for comments and technical difficulties that you might have. And please mute yourself if you are not speaking. We are, of course, still in the middle of a pandemic, although less so, but also amid other compounding crises, and everyone is experiencing this differently. So please, let's be kind and caring. So most of you, I think, are familiar faces already. But for those of you that are joining us for the first time, the reason why we started organizing these calls is because we want to better understand how the open movement can respond meaningful to the climate crisis. It has been a super interesting journey since we started this almost a year ago. So this is like our season 2 of Open Climate Calls. And like we've seen more and more people get excited about the relationship between open and climate. And it has been super interesting to see how we can spark some of these conversations. And for today's call, we're going to have Jean-Noé Landry. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. We're very happy to have you here. Of course, you can go ahead and introduce yourself, and he will be talking about the intersection of environmental justice data and digital rights, an opportunity for open climate collaboration. So Jean-Noé, the floor is all yours.
Wonderful. Thank you, Evelyn. And thank you for this group. Just kind of grateful for the the organizers. These things don't happen by accident, and so I just want to kind of recognize the effort that it takes to hold this space like this one. And just to say that I was like very enthusiastic and excited to kind of come across it, as you'll kind of understand as I go through the presentation for today. And I'll share my screen in a second, just to kind of premise that I'm really looking to have a kind of a dialogue and a conversation about this. I'm attempting to name kind of a field of collaboration that, in my mind, with the background that I have as an open data activist and doing open government work for several years, I kind of see a big opportunity, but it's a complicated and messy one. So I'm kind of naming it, and let's explore it together. So let me share my screen here. Can you see it? Yeah. Okay. So just very briefly, especially for those of you who I haven't met in the past. So I used to be the executive director of Open North, nonprofit organization based in Canada, founded in 2011. I'm not the founder. The founder was more of a developer, so somebody who was building websites more from like the civic tech community. I came in having led a citizens initiative that lobbied successfully for the first open data policies in Canada. And prior to that, I was doing a lot of work internationally in kind of democratic systems and post-revolutionary and post-conflict contexts. And so when I came into Open North, went through a big kind of transformation, just like many organizations that have been doing data and technology work over time have done. And we really kind of brought a focus on kind of the ethics of data and technology, right? And developing a shift from product-based to service-based, focus more on research. When I speak about research, I mean kind of participatory action research and really putting emphasis on capacity building and holding a space for communities of practices as well. And the main stakeholders that we work with were cities, but not exclusively, very much in a kind of collaborative governance perspective. Okay, so that's enough about Open North. And how that plays out, I think it's important just to kind of name a couple of examples that informs the conversation for today. So when I led Open North, I was very interested in some of the new fields of practices from an open data perspective, right? So having mindfulness around the principles, the mindset, the culture, the values of the open and open data community, and how does that translate into new fields of collaboration? Here are three different examples. One is on urban resilience. So this is from a 2016 paper that we co-authored, where we knew that urban planners, they obviously know a lot about like urbanism, but they weren't necessarily looking at open data as part of their work. In the middle, smart cities, lots of kind of data governance issues, transparency, accountability. We're talking about surveillance capitalism, like these types of notions. So how does openness fit in a smart city system? And then the third example around decolonization and the reconciliation process in Canada. How do settlers in North America and elsewhere need to think much more critically about the principles and the intentions that we have when we speak about open data, and we talk about very powerful data systems that fundamentally are about kind of sovereignty and power relationships. Okay, so just kind of like to set the stage in terms of background here. Some of these might already be familiar to you. I'm very interested in kind of beyond open data, right? We've talked open data, I don't know how many waves we're in now. I think we're in the third wave. I think we're riding a fourth wave, maybe somewhere else. Okay. But I think there's an evolution of the discourse and the concepts, right? And we know that we're not just building websites to make data accessible. We know there's so many, data repositories. There's a whole graveyard of data repositories out there that nobody has really used and whatnot. So when I led Open North, I was very interested in kind of the collaborative governance and data governance that required notions around intersectoriality and intersectionality, and developing systems and enabling conditions for collaboration to take place that brought together different types of stakeholders to build trust around data sharing, which was really kind of a key thing that kind of made me think more critically about not just going from closed to open, but that shared data space, right? That I think is really kind of even more critical now in the context of a climate emergency. And so after I left Open North, I was honored to be selected as an Obama Scholar through a program that brought 12 different civic activists internationally, very much because of the work that I did as a leader in the open data space in Canada and elsewhere. But I came to Columbia University at the climate school, with kind of like high level kind of like observations, right? So looking at climate science and going like, well, we know what the problems are. It's not a lack of data. There's a lot of data. If anything, there's like not necessarily an overabundance, but there's an abundance. There's volumes of data, and the volume of data is just, the curve just keeps going up and up and up, because we know that it's exponential, right? At the same time, in parallel to this, we're also seeing kind of, grassroots or community kind of mobilization that's happening, because there's much more, there's an urgency around putting in place a level of preparedness and planning, because we're feeling the consequences of that climate emergency. But the data scientists and the community organizers aren't necessarily speaking to each other, and they don't necessarily have modes of collaboration that facilitates, the types of exchanges and ways that we're now feeling, I think, an increased kind of impetus to actually kind of facilitate that. But that's a very difficult, potentially problem to resolve, because we're coming from very different timescales, objectives, cultures, ways of doing things, from that intersectional perspective. So that was kind of like my premise when I came to Columbia as I left Open North. I think it's important also, just to kind of name, sometimes we have like personal experiences that, kind of compel us to act, right? To kind of force us to kind of have a lived experience that kind of makes us kind of recognize, whoa, the thing that I thought was happening, like I am also, subject to it. And for me, when I moved to Harlem in northern Manhattan last August, I experienced a climate disaster. And these were flash floods in Harlem. This was like three weeks after I had moved there. And on the right, you see the modeling, the warnings that climate scientists and meteorologists were communicating well in advance. And I remember being, in the cafe in front of my apartment, and then the skies just opened. And that's actually just in front of my apartment where you see that. And I went inside my apartment. I started getting like notifications that were very conflicting from my utilities company that was telling me, watch out, watch out. There's a tornado risk as well. You need to go into your basement. And then the city sending me text messages, watch out, flash flood warning. I was like, what's going on here, right? So as a resident of Harlem, that kind of made me realize, okay, I'm at risk and there are certain kind of vulnerabilities that I'm subject to because of the climate and the way that we manage, our responses. And I struggled to find good sources of information and resources that would enable me to, protect myself and also, my neighbors. So that was, something very, very tangible that I brought with me as I started at Columbia University. And so when we look into the IPCC report that was published, I know there's been a few other kind of editions and volumes that came out since then, but the one that came out last fall, and we look at the modeling around, the types of actions to reduce vulnerability, exposure, and hazards, all from that kind of risk, kind of like assessment. I started to wonder, like, what's the data behind all these different actions? How do we collaborate to kind of unlock that data? Who's responsible and accountable for actually taking those actions? So what are the digital and data kind of systems behind each of those actions? And how do we situate not just risk at the center, but how do we situate community resilience and who's most at risk and why? So this is more the kind of social justice kind of like value system that I'm bringing into this type of like, very kind of like scientific kind of like analysis, right? I was like, who's advantaged? Who's disadvantaged? Who's more vulnerable and why? What are the historical reasons for that? And how can data kind of expose and enable us to not just mitigate those risks, but actually help address some of the socioeconomic and political kind of reasons around why such people are more at risk than others, according to different types of climate scenarios. So that was kind of like my premise going into this. So I connected with, so I did what I'm kind of doing today is to go back to what I consider kind of my community because of my values and principles. And I went to the Open Data Charter. And for those of you who are not familiar with the Open Data Charter, I really kind of urge you to go and visit their website. The Open Data Charter, it's a charter. So it's a set of principles that define what open data is around the world, and governments adopt the charter. And once you adopt the charter, then we're starting to speak the same language because there's an agreement on those principles and we're able to collaborate and we recognize, not just the values, but we recognize the potential outcomes that can come from the adoption of those principles. And so what the Open Data Charter has done over time is also develop what they call open up guides. And they've done open up guides on a range of different types of issues, including contracting, open contracting, for example, in collaboration with the Open Contracting Partnership. I think they've done one on like agricultural data with like GODAN and other types of institutions. But of course, there's a big need for one around the climate. And so they're in the process of developing an open up guide that will help not only prioritize, but also kind of align in the taxonomy and the typification and the type of like the metadata to describe, different types of data sets that we should align not only in the release, but in the usability of, if we're serious about, tackling, climate change in a coordinated kind of action, and purposeful way. Otherwise we get lost in all those data systems, in all those data repositories. So the Open Up Guide is meant to kind of enable us, easier and more impactful access to the right data set to facilitate coordination. So I looked at that and then I asked questions around, okay, like what data sets align more closely or are more relevant for vulnerable populations according to the different types of risks that I named kind of early in the earlier slides. And they hadn't been focusing on that. They were talking more about emissions, they were talking about standards, right? So like the things that we know, in the climate conversation, that's very, very important. But I wasn't necessarily seeing the social justice type of like element and the types of issues that comes when you talk about vulnerable populations in those types of like data systems. It's like, okay, well, there seems to be a need, but I'm going to keep digging. I'm going to keep going. And this kind of led me to think about, and because because I'm in the United States, and I'll admit to it, but in Canada, we don't talk about environmental justice as much as in the United States. And we talk about environmental justice in the context of Indigenous data rights from that perspective. But in the mainstream in Canada, it's not a discourse that's been as widely and as broadly and as deeply adopted as it is in the United States because of, clear identity and historical kind of issues around racism and about slavery, which we also have in Canada, not to the same extent and not the same history. And so I started kind of asking questions around, well, is there such a thing as environmental justice data? And I spoke to a number of different academics in Colombia. Obviously, it was interesting at first because I was talking to climate scientists, and the climate scientists were like, well, I develop models, I develop scenarios. I can tell you who's going to get which pretty much very precisely, which part of, which cities is going to have the biggest kind of impact on rising sea levels or heat maps or, whatever. But when you talk to climate scientists around environmental justice data, that wasn't necessarily a connection that they were making. It seemed like environmental justice organizations that were mobilizing at the grassroots were kind of expected to look at the climate science to interpret it for their own kind of mission and purposes. But there was not the opposite that was happening. Climate scientists weren't necessarily looking at environmental justice issues and interpreting their own data in order to develop their analysis that was useful for other purposes. So I thought that was kind of like an interesting, kind of gap, in kind of the data conversation that really kind of situated itself in what the IPCC report is fundamentally talking about. And we know that in the most recent kind of edition of the IPCC report, it now talks about environmental justice as being one of the drivers of collaboration. So it's kind of elevating climate justice now at a global lens. So one of the sources that I looked at, because I also have kind of a democracy type of background. So I was like, are there politicians, where's the momentum, around environmental justice? And is there anybody who's categorized or developed some sort of who's identified different types of environmental justice. And this is a senator who proposed a bill in the U.S. Legislative process that kind of named different kind of categories. And I know that they had consulted pretty broadly with environmental justice kind of organizations. But when you look at that, and I'm only giving a couple of examples here, when you look at that, we're talking about practitioners in education, public health, public services, right, that have been working on the front lines of providing services to vulnerable populations and different types of populations, but not necessarily looking at how data can be shared across sectors and across their activities, partly because of the perceived risk of sharing data that could be compromising personal information. So I was like, okay, well, there's something there around, again, from an openness perspective that kind of made me think like there's an opportunity and there's potentially something big that the open community could provide or support. One of the ways that was important to me because of my experience in Harlem as a resident was to get involved with an environmental justice organization. And so We Act for Environmental Justice is a leader in the US. Their executive director is on an advisory group, Peggy Shepard, with the president of the US and all that. I joined a working group that designed a public engagement process to engage with local residents to identify what are their information and resource needs in preparation and for better planning for different type of extreme weather events, just like the one that I had experienced. And so the conversations that we had with local residents, and I co-facilitated one of the consultation, it wasn't about data, because we all know that if you talk about data right away, often many people kind of switch off. They want to talk about kind of issues. They want to talk about their lived experience. And in this case, the types of problems that they were focused on, was, am I in a, in which evacuation zone am I in? Why is, this housing, more disadvantaged than others? Where can I access, my information around kind of energy kind of needs, and how can I be sure that I won't be able to, or that I'll be able to access that, if something happens. So we categorized all their needs, and then they're building a digital tool to basically have like customized maps, where you can actually kind of better prepare based on different types of information and resources. It's the residents in understanding why they're vulnerable that is kind of the underlayer of the kind of analysis that wasn't happening necessarily in that initiative, but from an environmental justice kind of data perspective, it's something that could actually provide a lot of value in understanding the context there. I think a lot of, and this is kind of based on limited experience. What I'm also seeing when you talk to environmental justice organizations, and I haven't done kind of research on this, but just kind of anecdotally speaking to a few of them, when you talk about their digital capacity, and right now they're getting a lot more funding to mobilize locally, a lot of these organizations are advocacy groups. They want to change policies. They want to defend the rights of people, locally. They don't necessarily have, full-time IT managers or people that are collecting data and kind of, having data-driven advocacy or collecting data to kind of systematically provide analysis on environmental justice. They mobilize, they develop plans, they help prepare communities, but they don't necessarily have the internal kind of like capacity to think about the critical aspects of data collection that, probably most of us in this workshop have, worked on. I was like, okay, well, there's a gap here potentially. Let's move on. I also wanted to, so as I was doing that volunteering and continuing at Columbia to talk to climate scientists and whatnot, I wanted to learn more from other organizations, and you probably know the Engine Room, that kind of share a very kind of strong kind of proposition around social justice, already talking about kind of intersectional kind of approaches, which I think is quite interesting that we're talking about intersectionality from a data and digital kind of rights advocacy, but within the context of the pandemic, and how vulnerable populations within the pandemic with, contact tracing apps, for example, were more subject to abuses of how that data was being used. So I could already kind of see some parallels with kind of environmental justice and potentially the digital rights community as well. Okay, and just by the way, the Engine Room, I spoke to them a couple of weeks ago. They're going to be publishing a report soon on digital rights and environmental justice as well. So there's an emerging kind of conversation there. Okay, so as we move, also recognizing from the open data community, because I know a lot of the organizations and I know of them by reputation or directly. I wanted to also kind of look at, who else is doing research that fits a little bit more closely with kind of the open data kind of perspective. This is from the Center for Open Data Enterprise, based in Washington, DC. And just to say it, I think it's really interesting to see how open data organizations and open government organizations are pivoting or shifting towards, or into the climate space. And we're all kind of finding our way, how to kind of, contribute or to be useful in that space, right? And so one of the ways that they did, because they host roundtables, that's what they've done over many years, as they're getting into the climate space, one of their reports was on data for climate risk assessment in vulnerable communities. And if we look at the recommendations here to kind of bring it back into the environmental justice and digital rights kind of intersection, we're looking at recommendations around the use of existing and new funding mechanisms to support community level data use. So when we talk about community data use of vulnerable populations, what are the risks of collecting data, about vulnerable people, where that could compromise, personal identity, could compromise, issues around kind of like data security, or even kind of like access of data from community perspective. I've just highlighted the conclusions or the recommendations rather that I think kind of I'm reading from my own lens here, but engaging citizens in data collection and use, for sure there's a digital rights angle to that. If you're going to do that well, you need to engage the community in what data they're collecting, who's going to be hosting the data. The same with developing communities of practice to understand, integrate data from different sources. So I think from a data management and a data governance perspective, I was reading this from a digital rights angle. And so where's the momentum around this? And we've got very different kind of approaches that are coming up. We all know who this is. So the Bezos Earth Fund, huge amounts of money just because he can, and some people want to buy Twitter and others want to invest. But so in this case, and I think just a bigger question is like, what do we do with philanthropy like this? Is it better for some people to use that funding for good? So there's maybe an ethical kind of like dilemma around those types of investments from philanthropy. At the same time, so with putting that aside, an injection of $443 million for environmental justice and climate, that's not an insignificant amount of funding. And so what the Bezos Earth Fund has been doing with the Center for Open Data Enterprise that I named earlier, is what they're calling a climate environmental justice collaborative. And so they're doing this from a technical perspective. And I participated in their roundtables. And it was interesting. you had comments, from the environmental justice community saying, who the hell are you? Like, we've been doing this for decades. You're not going to come here and tell us what to do. So lots of pushback. At the same time, and I think, I don't want to diminish, how important that is, because it's about respect and mobilization and kind of understanding the context of where and who has been kind of engaging here. I think it raises important issues around, as we move towards the acceleration of mobilization that uses a lot more data in the environmental justice space, what type of digital infrastructure are we going to be creating? And what are the potential risks around sharing the data that I've named a little bit earlier? As we learn more and more, and as we start kind of from an open kind of perspective, kind of unlocking data silos, and we go into the shared data collaborative space as well. And on the other end of, I'm not going to put it on the spectrum, but I also had the opportunity to meet with the new director at Open Society Foundations. And interestingly, it was less a discussion about data and much more about a social justice discourse, right? Even though, we know that they fund a lot of data, projects, and they do a lot of research and whatnot. So just to kind of I'm not trying to reconcile, I'm not trying to pick a side. I'm just kind of naming that there's an emerging kind of conversation that is kind of pulling us in different directions. For today, what I was really hoping to do, because as you're hearing here, I'm not providing you with a model, I'm not providing you with a framework. I'm attempting to name a conversation that might resonate with you from your own, maybe your own organizational or individual perspective as, belonging within a community that shares values around openness. And so the questions that I identified for us today to facilitate a discussion is, have you encountered environmental justice data in your work and collaborations? Is that a thing for you? And if it is, let's talk about it, because I think it seems like it's something that we need to kind of talk a little bit more. And maybe I'm just not in the loop. I don't pretend that I've talked to, there's a lot of people on this call that I don't know. So I'm kind of, I'm hoping to learn from you as well. What are the digital rights issues related to such data types? Any specific examples of situations that, come to mind? And just to say it, when I think of digital rights, I look at there's a lot of different frameworks, it's not going to be realistic to take a GDPR model and apply that to an environmental justice community, kind of mindset or space. I'm thinking more about the community access, kind of mobilizations, an example of that would be the Detroit Digital Rights Coalition, which is quite a good example in my mind, that has a lot of kind of social legitimacy, because it's been inclusive and it's almost like a collective agreement around, what these rights ought to be. And then thirdly, does the intersection between environmental justice data and digital rights matter for the open community? And if so, what can we do about it? And maybe we're already doing stuff about it. And maybe this is a space, where recognizing that, as an open community, what I love the most about the open community is that not only do we have, common kind of underpinning values, but we all have different kind of expertise. And usually my experience has been, we also have our foot in other communities, and we act as kind of bridge builders and kind of conveners, and we see kind of multiple communities at once because we work in the open, and we're able to straddle these different communities. And with that in mind, who should be involved, in this conversation as well. So I'll stop there, and yeah, let's talk.
So also, let's see if anyone has questions. I see that Alex has raised his hand. And before we go into Alex's question, I'm gonna abuse a little bit of my power here as a facilitator. And this thing of the overabundance of data that you mentioned at the beginning, just yesterday, we had a very interesting call with someone that is working on trying to present projects for climate finance, right? And one of the problems that they are having is that all these funds, like the Green Climate Fund and whatever, is asking them for a lot of data that they have to produce in order to have access to those funds. So I'd be very cautious about like talking about overabundance of data. I think there are like problematic aspects to it. But yeah, that's kind of my 2 cents. And Alex, over to you. And then if someone else wants to ask a question, please raise your hand or also use the chat.
Well, actually, my question was similar. So I'm Alex Benson. I work at the Wikimedia Foundation, and a lot of my work is with communities in the global south, particularly in Africa and Latin America. And one of the things I'm noticing, and I spent a lot of time watching the youth movement and watching kind of how the climate movement has formed and created rhetorical positions and stuff. And climate justice, to me, is behaving a lot differently than environmental justice as it behaved in North America. And so I'm wondering, kind of, are you encountering different data needs as like someone approaches it? I'm an environmental justice organizer, and then they sit on the other side of the line and it's like, I'm a climate justice organizer. Are they like asking different questions of the data? Because I get, like during the engine room consultations you mentioned, or no, it wasn't that. I was on a working group from one of the UN agencies, WHO, I think, or a presentation meeting where they were like, there's an organizer in Liberia, and he was like, it's not so much that we need environmental justice data, is that we need the like data so that we can adapt in the face of something that like we're not able to affect at all. And it's a climate justice thing in the sense that like we need the data to get the money, to get the et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? It's like a stacking kind of a la carte. So I'm wondering how those things kind of intersect or divide.
Yeah, I mean, those are like, I think that's an important question. I can't speak to how, obviously the global South kind of like views that. I think the conversations that I've had, in a very kind of privileged setting at Columbia, speaking to, for example, like the Columbia Global Centers, and speaking to their kind of offices around the world about this type of issue, is to your point. I think the discourse isn't necessarily one that is a primary lens, that informs the work that they're looking at the climate and the type of kind of ways to, mitigate and adapt. So I agree with you. And what you're also naming is, I think very important from an ethical perspective around kind of imposing a certain kind of like context and a mindset and a history, and kind of assuming or presuming that this ought to be something that is kind of adopted worldwide. So I'm very careful about that and sensitive about that. I think that for the environmental justice organizations that I've spoken to, and I think we'll see what comes out of the Center for Open Data Enterprise work, because there was 150 or up to 200 different organizations and leaders that participated in their roundtables. And they asked those questions. What data are you using? What are the obstacles, access, all the things that we know about. And so in my mind, this is kind of like a pretty kind of a concerted effort around, documenting what the data needs are based on different types of problems that they're encountering through their work. So the accountability to the community is extremely important for environmental justice organizations. And I'm fairly new to the environmental justice space as well. So I have a strong background in data and, that part of the activism. So I'm going to thread carefully around these conversations. I think what we may end up seeing, is, and I think you kind of alluded to it as well, is the environmental rights kind of like discourse that might be kind of a connector, you know, on a global scale around different types of issues that we can start to have a like better kind of context driven kind of problem kind of framing, and recognizing that if you're facing rising sea, you know, waters, whether it's in India or in the US, there's probably some core data sets, you know, that we need to be able to coordinate on. But who's collecting that data? And to your point as well, like the incentives around data collection to access money, I mean, that's usually not the best way to kind of force kind of a data-driven conversation as well. So I don't have answers to that, but those are just my reflections and observations around those issues.
I see that we also have some questions from, I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly here, Sanchana. Do you want to take the mic and ask them, or do you want me to ask them out loud?
No, thank you. I can go ahead. Appreciate the opportunity. Thanks. This has been a really interesting discussion, and it sort of centers around a lot of conversations that I think I'm having in a couple of different organizations around, you know, how environmental research can kind of prioritize environmental justice issues, and how we, you know, reconcile academia as a whole and the culture of science and doing science with the necessity of environmental justice against the backdrop of the climate crisis. And then also just kind of around the culture and like, you know, the tech space and kind of how we handle some of these issues. So this was kind of covered, I think, already in the brief exchange between you and Alex, which was wonderful. But, you know, one thing that came to mind is just how can we, when we're talking about, you know, the question, have you encountered environmental justice data in your work? How can we come up with a flexible definition of that term? Because as you mentioned, you're in Canada, and environmental justice conversations have a completely different tone than they do here in the United States, where I'm based. They also have a completely different tone, you know, in Lebanon or in India or in Brazil, you know, and so often, even though, you know, in my role as an academic, we're trying to collaborate with people across the world, when we're having these conversations, just our understanding of how we're using these terms is like completely and totally different. So I just wonder if you or any other members of the group kind of have some thoughts around, you know, when we say environmental justice data, what do we mean, and how do we kind of maybe sidestep this introduction of like another academic term that's really helpful for us, right? It's really helpful to have a standardized definition, but also then kind of turns into, you know, more of a, how do we define this properly, and how do we treat it in practice? So like, how do you think we can kind of start balancing all of those different things?
I've got some quick thoughts on that, and I guess the way that I've encountered part of what you're naming, you know, having been based in New York and having spoken to a number of different climate scientists, it's kind of like naming what are the boundaries of what we know through climate science, and what is the complementarity of, I guess, what I'm kind of naming as like community wisdom, or community kind of like, I don't want to go intelligence, but just like the wisdom of communities, and what is the bridge there, and how are we more explicit, you know, from an environmental justice lens around what we know and what we don't know. And I think that's probably more, as you're naming, that's probably more interesting to understand than, you know, being held up on definitions as well. So, and I've had the opportunity through my volunteering with We Act, as I've been kind of, you know, involved quite actively, you know, in one of their working groups, to connect them to climate scientists that specialize in flooding, flash floods. So for sure, at Columbia, there's somebody who specializes only in flash floods, and they know the data very, very well. And I invited them to meet with We Act, and it was a fascinating discussion. And it was fascinating because of the humility that the climate scientists had in kind of naming, I only know what I know from the data. And you guys know a lot more about this and that and that. And so that was kind of like the climate, bridging climate science to action and justice that I saw there. And I feel there's probably a lot more opportunities along those lines that are probably more productive from more coordinated action than, you know, the research, the purer kind of like research interests there that you're also acknowledging. So I definitely appreciate the question.
Shannon, you had your hand up.
Oh, it was a follow-up to the previous prompt that Alex had. Maybe I just want to mention one thing here. So hi, Shannon Dosmegan. I'm one of the Open Climate Community Coordinators, but my primary position is with the Open Environmental Data Project. I spent a lot of time thinking about environmental data in the context of the US and was a practitioner in this space for a decade previous. So Scan and I, and then my team at OEDP, we wrote an issue brief on climate justice, environmental justice, and the need for kind of thinking about them cohesively, but also places, and this gets a bit to your question, Sujana, in especially the United States, because we're having such a moment around, environmental justice through the Justice 40 initiative. We're seeing congressional legislation, running through our systems right now, where we do need to be particular about what we mean by environmental justice and environmental justice data. So that brief is coming out with the ones that Jean-Noé mentioned related to the engine room in relation to digital rights. So that might be of interest to you as well, and would be happy to send you a direct link to that.
Since we're sharing, there's a presentation that I saw recently with an organization that I didn't know about, which maybe some of you actually do, because you're all very, very active in this space, on sectional environmentalism, that I thought was quite an interesting kind of way of kind of the bridge that we're talking about. And I think the emerging type of new skill set, that is needed as intermediaries and facilitators and stewards, and kind of the ethics of straddling kind of like different communities, and the resourcefulness that already exists, because of years and decades of mobilization, but looking ahead as well. So I just wanted to share that too. I'm just looking at the comments.
Yeah. I hope I'm pronouncing her name correctly. Piro is making a lot of good comments. She cannot speak, unfortunately, but she's like she's rocking the chat, let's say. I don't know if anyone else wants to make another comment, or maybe go back to any of the questions that also Jean-Noé put out there for us.
Jim, you got a hand.
Go ahead. Yeah.
Hi, thanks everyone. A really fascinating presentation and following debate. A question around data and its use for modelling during the pandemic. I'm based in the UK, and the pandemic modelling was forecasting, we'd all be dead by the end of the week. It was wildly inaccurate, but the government based a whole bunch of decisions and policies and everything else on basically poor modelling, really. So are we in danger of using the M word, the modelling word, and it being almost tainted by what's happened with pandemic modelling?
Could I just say, and in the context of environmental justice, this is current in the US, and I think it holds pretty strongly in many other countries, is that the role of environmental agencies, the way that we think about data, is in demonstration that no harm has been done and that we haven't reached the emitting levels that are permittable. So I think yes, and climate modeling is a very different thing, but the strategies of thinking about use of data when it comes to corporate malfeasance, specifically around industrial polluters, does not set us on that course.
I think there's something also to be said around, like in a context of emergency, the incentives to be working in the open are like, we need to double down on that. And I think there's a tendency, and there could be a reflex, that we see a shift away from kind of the gains that we've seen around kind of openness and access and transparency and accountability. So as a community, that's something that I'm concerned about, because decisions need to be made faster. because there's bigger kind of budgets, because the repercussions are, are graver, where we expose ourselves, if we work in a city, or a government, to potential liabilities because the stakes are perceived as being higher. So I think there's a pretty serious kind of issue, that's going to get harder and harder with time. So I think there's solidarity around that in my mind, from an openness kind of community to be even more watchful of, how and where money gets spent, as we mitigate and as we adapt to the climate risks.
Yeah, I'm into that. Douglas, you had your hand up.
Yeah, thank you, Evelyn. My name is Douglas. I'm from the Wikimedia Community User Group in Uganda, and I'm here to understand more about the topic open data and climate and how they interlink. So thank you, Jean, for the wonderful presentation. I would like to comment on one of the discussion points that you raised at the end, who should be involved in this conversation. You mentioned a couple of organizations and data partners like ODI, and a list of a few like for participatory practices anyway. But maybe what is your view on the involvement of Wikimedia? I know like Alex is here, and you understand that there's a campaign running, Wiki for Human Rights with the right to a health environment as the theme. But I'd like to maybe hear your views before Alex jumps in on how the involvement of Wikimedia can be utilized under this topic of climate and open data. Thank you.
Thank you to you. I don't have the answer to that question. And I think that in the context of a space like this one, my understanding is that we're also here to kind of inform each other of how we're all kind of playing a role into this. And I think that that's part of the challenge that we're facing now, is to actually just have a common place where we can actually explain what we do and see, and to like avoid overlap and duplication, and actually kind of support each other as well. So I'm with respect to your question, I'd like to hear from from Alex, how he sees his role and what he's already doing. I want to learn from Alex.
Yeah, I think so. I put a blog post out recently about Wikimedia is kind of a communications tool in the face of this. So I think the challenge when we talk to data practitioners is that they tend to get sucked into the data set conversation, which is like, how do we like manipulate these huge tables of information? And the challenge is that the thing that most decision makers need is the analysis, right? They need the like conclusions from that big body of data. And so there's like two problems that need to be addressed. First is like, we need people in the communities themselves able to do the analysis and publish about it. And I think in the Global South, there's a lot of like graduate programs and stuff that are publishing, but it may not look like academic papers as we've thought about it. And this is where the IPCC will like not look at the analysis, but there might be an academic repository somewhere that has it, right? Or there might be a journalist, or there might be someone who like actually has produced some analysis that is impactful. And then on the second part is where Wikimedia, I think, really comes in, which is making sure that there's a public record of that analysis, that like someone will be able to find it at some point, right? And it's on both sides of it, like, are like businesses doing injustices that are human rights injustices that are just making the situation worse, or governments or whatever actor. And then, can we anticipate the future we're going into, right? Like, can we like use the analysis to communicate that story? And so I'm imagining, Jean-Noé, and I'm going to throw it back to you, like a lot of the conversations you've had have been more about like, how do we get the data in the hands of the people who need to do the analysis, right? Is that kind of a fair assessment? Or
that's one piece of it. That's one piece of it. And recognizing that that's, to your point, it's the analysis and the context. It needs to be context driven. and who is better positioned to provide better understanding of the actual situation of the type of risks and vulnerabilities. And I think that's an opportunity for like global north south, however we want to call it, like, you know, collaboration from an open kind of community.
Great. I'm noticing we only have 2 minutes left for the conversation. So just a reminder there on the chat, if you would like to receive information on other goals, please put your email there. We always clean up the agenda afterwards, so we don't leave any like personal information that might identify you or might, you know, put you at risk of being contacted involuntarily. So do not worry about that. And also thanks, Jean-Noé, again for your presentation, and everyone for being here. I don't know if you want to make any final comments or reflections.
I mean, I don't think there's a conclusion to this conversation. Just express kind of like gratitude around kind of the opportunity, and also just kind of feeling that, you know, we're all kind of, you know, playing a role or thinking about this in our own ways. And so I don't know where this is going to go, but I feel like this is kind of a good space to discuss these issues. So I look forward to participating in the next groups.
Great. Thanks, everyone.
Excellent. Very useful.
Thanks. Bye-bye.